You can support In the Past Lane with as little as $1 a month. Just go to the support page at our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks. In late December 1776, things were looking mighty good for the British effort to crush the incipient American Revolution. British forces had won a string of victories in 1776, including a smashing defeat of George Washington's forces in New York. All that remained was the defeat of what was left of Washington's army. But then, two things happened. First, George Washington took the offensive, crossed the Delaware River into New Jersey, and defeated the British at Trenton and soon thereafter at Princeton. And second, the people of New Jersey mounted a ferocious resistance against the British, attacking outposts and foraging parties looking for food and supplies. By the spring of 1777, the ranks of the Continental Army were swelling, and confidence was on the rise. And the British, quite the opposite. Racked by exposure, hunger, disease, and injury due to near constant harassment by Washington's forces, New Jersey militia, and bands of New Jersey citizens, about 1/3 of the British Army was listed as unfit for duty. And diaries, letters, and official dispatches from the period make clear that a sense of despair had set in. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 65, in which we take up the question of how and why the vastly more powerful British lost the American Revolution. We are coming to you this week from the Intolerable Acts Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Guarding our flanks and keeping us information is our delightful executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So what's happening at In the Past Lane this week? Well, it's the home stretch for the semester, so everyone's a bit weary and more than a little daunted by the work remaining. Papers to write, papers to grade, and all that. But our spirits have been lifted this week by what appears to be the arrival of spring. As I speak, it's 65 degrees outside and sunny. And if that doesn't sound warm to you, keep in mind that it snowed in Massachusetts twice last week. It didn't amount to much, but snow in mid-April? Okay, time is a precious commodity this time of year, so I need to be brief so we can get to this episode's main feature, my interview with historian Andrew O'Shaughnessy, author of the book The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire. He was in town recently to speak at the American Antiquarian Society, which is located in Worcester, Massachusetts. Quick reminder, folks, you can help In the Past Lane by subscribing to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. And loyal listeners, you can help us build our listening community by telling your friends about In the Past Lane and saying nice things about us on social media. Personal recommendations are one of the most common ways that people discover new podcasts. So please, talk it up. Okay, people, pack some extra ammo for this one. We're off to harass some redcoats. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. Good history always starts with good questions. And every now and again, a historian comes along to pose a different sort of question about a familiar topic. In the case of my guest today, Andrew O'Shaughnessy looked at the American Revolution, and instead of asking for the millionth time why the Americans won, he asked why the British lost. The result was the book The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire. This book received 8 national awards, including the George Washington Book Prize and the Society of Military History Book Prize. Andrew O'Shaughnessy is Vice President of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello and Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He is the author of many books, including An Empire Divided, The American Revolution and the British Caribbean. Andrew O'Shaughnessy, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you, Ed. It's delightful to be here.
Well, here we are. We should explain where we are. We're at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. And this is one of the great archives, one of the great libraries for American history anywhere in the United States. And it's also mid-April. So in 1 week from today, Boston will be celebrating Patriots' Day, which is obviously connected to the American Revolution, which is sort of a good setup for us to talk about your book. Now, you'll be speaking tonight at the Antiquarian Society on the 10 men who lost America. And that'll be the basis of what we're going to be talking about today. So why don't we begin by talking about, there's a bunch of different ways to begin it, but it seems in some ways that your book is about challenging a fundamental myth about why the British lost the American Revolution. And it has to do with this idea that there's this bungling generation of people that got promoted because of who they were and who they knew, and then suddenly they're generals, admirals, and politicians, when in fact, your examination of the record shows that this is a highly accomplished generation of people that will go on to great things. Some of them had accomplished great things prior to the American Revolution, but many of them would go on to really great things in their field of military, warfare and politics. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that myth of this bungling generation of Brits?
Well, that was a great summary. The book is called The Men Who Lost America. It's about the British side of the American Revolution and trying to explain why the British lost what they would call the War for America. And it was a war seemingly that they should definitely have won.
Right. On paper, it looks like no contest.
Absolutely. And we have to remember that this was the time when Britain was becoming the premier global power. It had just won what in Europe's called the 7 Years' War and what in America is called the French and Indian War, in which not only did they gain Canada and islands in the Caribbean, but they also took Bengal in India, which really becomes the major footprint for the British presence in India, which would be much larger than its presence in America in terms of population. And they went on, after the American Revolutionary War, to defeat the French revolutionary armies and ultimately to defeat Napoleon. And many of those officers involved in the campaign into upstate New York and culminating in the defeat at Saratoga, many of those officers would later be senior commanders and play a role in the defeat of Napoleon, arguably the greatest general of all time. So my book really sets out to explain why that happened. And there is some analogy to a book called The Best and the Finest about the Vietnam War. And I'm arguing that in many ways it's a chimera to believe that the reason the British lost was simply because they had buffoons and aristocratic commanders, and that these were in many ways very able people. And the book is not simply about the commanders, it's also about the politicians. In order to understand the campaign, one needs to understand the politics behind it.
Right, particularly for a war that's taking place across a great ocean. So Lord North, you've profiled 10 men who all play a role. Some are military, some are political. And Lord North certainly is one of the most important figures because he's the guy back in England who's trying to put the hammer down on the colonies in the pre-revolutionary period, the period, the 1770s when he comes to office. And in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, he believes that a firm hand and a real crackdown is necessary. And then almost as quickly, once he realizes that begins to backfire and that there's actually tremendous unity among the Americans and the colonies, and that this tough policy is actually going to unify them further, he begins to try to backpedal it a little bit, and it's almost in some ways too late. So tell us a little bit more about Lord North.
So it's the 10 key decision makers, and it's set up rather like a play, so that each person is introduced at the point that they really play a major role. And Lord North to this day is known as the worst prime minister in British history. It was a very popular insult during the early 60s when Anthony Eden was prime minister, and also Harold Macmillan. It was a way to insult the prime minister. You're the worst prime minister since Lord North. It was used more recently against David Carradine and the Brexit decision. And it's really terribly unfair. This man was one of the most brilliant speakers in Parliament. He would regularly arrive, not for an hour each week, like the current Prime Minister, and people watch C-SPAN and they admire the way Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, and Theresa May are there taking questions from Parliament, debating and arguing. Lord North would do this 3 days a week, and he would arrive midday, and he'd usually wait till the evening and often make a 2-hour speech without notes, and regularly deflect one of the most capable oppositions of all time with people like Edmund Burke, who's regarded as the father of modern conservatism, Charles James Fox, and both William Pitt, the younger and elder, great speech makers, and yet North would deflect them. He was also doing 2 jobs of the modern day Prime Minister. Not only was he Prime Minister, but he was basically doing the equivalent of Treasurer, Secretary of the Treasury.
Right, he was a great financier.
He was a great financier, and France went bankrupt as a result of the American War of Independence. Britain had started to tax America because it was fearful of going bankrupt.
Back in the 1760s.
That's right. Its debt increased enormously during the American War, and yet North was an important part of how it stayed solvent. But what I found most remarkable about him was that he very quickly realized that the policy of coercion had been a great mistake.
And this is right in the wake of the Boston Tea Party.
Yes, and he went to great lengths to try to negotiate a peace. He made several offers, and he started doing it even before Lexington and Concord. But at the height of the war, he sent over someone called Lord Carlisle with a peace commission, and it offered America essentially to concede on everything. Britain would no longer ever tax America. They would repeal all legislation passed since the French and Indian War. And in other words, for the second half of the war, the only idea that Britain was fighting for was token and nominal control over America. America would have been like a Commonwealth country, like Australia and Canada and New Zealand. And that seemed to me remarkable, that he was not simply a believer in coercion.
And who are the other folks? So North is a crucial figure. And you have 10. We probably don't have time to go through all 10, but the Howe brothers are extremely important as well. These are sort of 2 sides of the military effort. One, the Army commander, Sir William Howe, and the other, the Admiral, Lord Richard Howe. And they are the 1-2 punch in the early going of the war, commanding this huge Navy and military that looks so indomitable, yet, things on the ground, things play out, or on sea, things play out a little bit differently. So who are these folks, and how does their experience in the war play out?
Well, the Howe brothers are the most mysterious because they wrote so little and said so little. They were famous in their own time period for being silent, and they seem in some ways to personify the image of a British officer in this period. And they were, after all, brothers, one who commanded the army and one who commanded the navy in America. So that in itself suggests a very corrupt system and simply nepotism. But in reality, Sir William Howe was chosen to command in America over 105 more senior generals. He'd only been a major general for about 3 years and was very junior. And he was chosen because he had such experience in America. He'd fought in the most successful British campaign in America, which was the siege of Quebec. He was present when General Wolfe died, and he was portrayed by Benjamin West in the painting next to Wolfe while he died, and he then continued the command to take the Plains of Abraham and essentially to make Canada British. His brother, Lord Richard Howe, was not the choice of the government at all. They didn't want to appoint him to command the Navy. William Howe insisted that if he commanded the army, his brother must command the Navy, which was very clever because the army and Navy were separately administered. And that meant that there was a perfect coordination because they were so close between the army and navy, and they were major innovators and pioneers in warfare.
That's an interesting thing because it's not just that they're brothers and sort of want to be on the same, same campaign, but Richard Howe, in particular, it seems, should be credited with really major advances in amphibious warfare, which is essentially landing troops via the Navy in very, very quick maneuvers. So tell us more about that, because this seems to be an important innovation.
Richard Howe later went on to become one of Britain's leading war heroes, and he had a great victory during the French Revolutionary Wars, known as the Glorious 1st of June. And before Nelson, Richard Howe was one of Britain's most popular heroes, commemorated on mugs and songs, on pub signs. Yeah. And he wrote the blueprint for what you rightly say is amphibious warfare. That's using boats and landing craft and coordinating with the army, rather like the landings at D-Day. And he may even have helped design the boats themselves, in which the bow would go forward like a gangplank, and the troops would just rush off. And these two brothers landed some 15,000 men on Staten Island within 3 hours in late August, as well as 40 cannon.
This is 1776.
Yes, and it was a remarkable feat. And at the time, the Patriots were incredibly intimidated because they were both such well-known commanders. Sir William Howe was also a pioneer in the army. He had played a big role in light infantry, which are a bit like modern-day commando forces. They wouldn't all just march in lines and fire in sequence.
That's another myth too, right? Because one of the ways Americans tell themselves about how we won the war against the British is that the British were so rigid in their, literally rigid in their lockstep maneuvers that they couldn't fight against these wily, Americans who were fighting behind stone walls and trees, when in fact Howe is designing and creating a kind of a force that is capable. He understands, even before the war begins, that it's probably going to be an unconventional war, at least on some level.
Well, Howe was actually chosen because of his experience in fighting what the English sometimes called Indian or bush warfare, and in which the maneuvers were very flexible. The British also had what they regarded as their secret weapon that was in many ways more effective than good marksmanship, which was use of the bayonet. And for much of the war, they could force patriots to run once they mounted a bayonet charge. So just fire a couple of sequences and then have a bayonet charge, which, as you can imagine, is terribly intimidating and also appalling to witness. And it's only in the later stages of the war that the Continental Army really becomes experienced enough that they can withstand these bayonet charges. Militia never could, and we tend to make heroes of the militia, and they did indeed play a major role in cutting British supply lines. But right to the very end of the war, a good example is the Battle of Guildford Courthouse, which was fought just a few months before Yorktown, and which should have been the final British defeat. The British, for the first time, were outnumbered under Cornwallis. But with a bayonet charge, they forced the Virginia and North Carolina militia to go into retreat right at the start of the battle, which created mayhem for Nathaniel Greene commanding on the American side.
It's interesting you mentioned the militia, and certainly here in Massachusetts, we can't get enough of the idea of the Minuteman who literally puts down his hoe or sets aside his plow, picks up his musket and runs off to fight in a battle. It's true, but it's also mythological in the sense that that's how the war was won. And so there are two questions I have about the war itself. One is, what goes wrong for the British? And maybe we could hold that thought for a moment and look at what goes right for the Americans. How does this overmatched, would-be independence movement of 13 ragtag colonies, would-be states, how does it actually withstand this incredible military force? You mentioned the Howe brothers sort of invading New York in the summer of 1776, and then in subsequent battle, the Battle of New York or the Battle of Long Island, Battle of Brooklyn has several names. Washington is almost crushed and, has only a few thousand troops left. Skedaddles out of New York. It really looks grim at that moment for the American cause. And yet a number of things transpire. And one of them is the creation of the Continental Army, not just this citizen soldier farmer army that we tend to think of with the Minutemen, but a real army that is disciplined and organized and capable of standing up to the British. How does that happen? And what else is there in the American mix that accounts for their success? And then maybe we could talk about what goes wrong with the British.
Well, I think one would certainly have to commend the leadership on the American side, and specifically George Washington. I always remind people of the alternatives to George Washington.
Who were waiting in the wings, many of them, whispering in the ears of Congress.
There was, for example, John Hancock, who was almost like an aristocratic dilettante and did get an opportunity to command Newport, Rhode Island, and was a disaster. Another very serious alternative to Washington was Charles Lee, known by an Indian name as Boiling Water Lee. And they're known as boiling water because of its temper. Well, imagine him dealing politically with Congress. And then there was Horatio Gates, who famously won at Saratoga, but was defeated by Cornwallis at Camden and supposedly charged about 250 miles from the battlefield on his horse. He was actually British by origin, but none of these people would have been effective as Washington. And one of the great lessons from Washington's leadership was his ability to take defeats and yet bounce back.
As evidenced in right out of the gate in 1776.
That's right.
Smashing defeat in New York. And then just a few months later, strikes very famously in New Jersey.
And then I think one would certainly emphasize the role of the Continental Army, how it does become as good as a European army, exceptionally well trained, and that it is able to fight conventional battles. We like to think the war, rather in the tradition of Mel Gibson's film The Patriot, is simply won by people behind bushes. That would never, and that would have tied down the British army, but it wouldn't have defeated them. The key turning points of the war, like Saratoga, like King's Mountain, like Yorktown, are conventional military battles, and the Continental Army is critical. And then finally, the strategy that General Nathaniel Greene devises in the South of integrating militia and the Continental Army. And Greene had an inferior force in the South to face Cornwallis, and so he had to make up for his inferiority by using the militia. But he understood crucially how to use that militia, not to fight conventional battles, but to cut the enemy's supply lines and assist the regular army until they could find the right grounds to confront the British. Daniel Morgan really perfected that strategy at Cowpens. And Morgan had on his front line the militia, and the British were used to them fleeing from the battlefield. And they did that. But behind the militia, he put the Continental Army, who just stood and withstood the attack and then counterattacked. And it was remarkably successful and defeated the then most successful and hated British commander, Bannister Tarleton.
Right. So the Americans benefit from a number of things. One, that's in sports, we'd say a home field advantage, but also great leadership and also great organizational capability to pull together that army. And obviously, in any case, war like this, any situation like this, luck plays a big role. But let's turn the tables now and say, summer of 1776, the British have moved into New York, taken the biggest city in North America, and smashed George Washington's army in that famous Battle of New York. And it looks like things are going quite well for them. But then how does it unravel? So almost...
The problem for the British is that they had an army of conquest, not an army of occupation. So they took every American city at some point during the war, beginning with Boston, New York, Charleston, Savannah, St. Augustine. But they could never really take territory. And the good example is after New York, when they span out into New Jersey, and they're encamped on the banks of the Delaware at Trenton. And over that winter, they lose about a third of their army. And it's partly the successful campaign of Washington at Trenton and Princeton. But more importantly, it's just regular attacks. And the fact that they do not have enough food and have to go on foraging campaigns in which they lose troops. So the fact that they never take territory means that they have to pretty well import a majority of their supplies from England.
No easy task.
Yes. With a very antiquated administrative system that wasn't up to doing this, and a lot of different departments of government with a small number of people all having to send handwritten orders, and small-sized farms supplying the needs of the army. It was too much for them. But ultimately what I argue is that they never felt they needed an army of occupation, and this was their greatest error. They could never, in fact, and Britain's a small country, it never had a big army, and it couldn't have created the kind of occupying force that was necessary. But they didn't believe they needed an occupying force because they believed, and here was the great error, that the majority of Americans supported them.
Right. There were people on the ground, Americans, who were telling them that this is just a radical fringe that has sort of seized hold of the colonies, and that you just need to show up and show them who's boss, and they will rally to your side. And this is what they think is the best information available, but it turns out it's people with great self-interest, these loyalists who have a lot to lose, who are goading on the British in this regard. And what they don't anticipate is, to use a modern term, the insurgency. So back to what you were saying about New Jersey, everywhere the British army went, they were faced with a hostile local populace, people that were, citizen soldiers in the sense that they would get out and cut supply lines, they would attack foraging parties. And so it became a really hostile environment for them. Tell us a little bit more about this misperception.
The fact is, counterinsurgence is still very difficult, as we discovered and are discovering in Afghanistan and discovered in Vietnam. And it's very difficult to read the view of people during warfare when a situation is in constant flux. So people were changing side all of the time. And even someone like John Adams seems to have believed that a third were loyal, a third supported the Patriots, and a third couldn't make up their mind and were pretty well neutral. My book would suggest otherwise, that the vast majority of the population really did support the Patriot war effort, even though, as was common among civilians at this time, they weren't necessarily involved directly. But it seems whenever push came to shove, like Lexington and Concord, or like Saratoga, and Burgoyne had crossed from Canada. He'd taken Fort Ticonderoga, which was the greatest fortification network of the time in America, and thought that he would literally walk and stroll right down towards Albany to meet Howe, and never imagined that when he outnumbered Gates's army 2-1, that once he got to Saratoga, he'd be outnumbered 4-1. He said people appeared from nowhere, from places the British thought uninhabited, like what was then called the Hampshire Grants. And he was too amazed by the quality of the troops that he was facing, and said in the evidence before Parliament afterwards that the war is being conducted on a great mistake, that they're capable, and that opinion is not with the British. Sir Henry Clinton, who was the British commander-in-chief for the second half of the war, talked about the need to win the hearts and the minds of Americans. It's a term that we've used much more recently, but he said we essentially need to win the hearts, and he put it, subdue the minds of the Americans. He understood ultimately it was a psychological warfare in which the support of the majority of people was all important. And he saw the ultimate difficulty was that the British needed to consolidate support and then move on. But the temptation was to just fight and then move elsewhere, and the Loyalists would then give up. But the Loyalists were certainly really very numerous. They probably were 1 in 5 of the population. 19,000 Americans fought for the British. In the film The Patriot, they show what is modeled on Bannister Tarleton with this very vicious cavalry, which indeed continued to kill men at the Battle of Waxhaws after they'd surrendered. But that cavalry was all Americans. I mean, it was an American loyalist cavalry. And undoubtedly the most vicious parts of the war were those fought between Americans. We have to remember, like really all revolutions, the American Revolution was also a civil war.
Right.
And a battle like King's Mountain, there was only one British officer present. Everyone else fighting were Americans.
Right. And that's actually one of the fascinating aspects of the larger picture of the American Revolution, which is it has that Civil War quality to it. And it's playing out on the ground in New Jersey and everywhere where the war takes place. But after the war, in most cases, those revolutions then become full-blown civil wars. You know, when you think of the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, so many others where they sides actually do go to war against each other. And somehow the Americans very narrowly avoid that fate. But it's still very much up in the air in the 1780s, 1790s. So how does this all, at some point, the strategy of winning the hearts and minds becomes impossible, if it was ever even tried? And how does this great booming, expanding, powerful empire decide in the early 1780s that this is just not worth it and that it's time to cut our losses, to do what a lot of countries can't do in many cases, which is to cut losses and go and leave behind this effort, leave behind the colonies?
Well, the British were never totally defeated. They could have continued after Yorktown. George III wanted to go on, and he saw Yorktown as a setback like Saratoga, but he pointed out quite rightly that the main British army was still in New York. They still had Canada. They still had Savannah and St. Augustine and Charleston. They could defeat the French, which they did in a naval battle soon after Yorktown called the Battle of the Saints in the Caribbean, and then return to the offensive in America. But what had changed was opinion in Parliament, and that the majority in Parliament were not willing to support the Prime Minister without an unequivocal promise that Britain would withdraw from America. They were very worried that this war would bankrupt Britain. They could see that all these claims that the majority of Americans supported the British were clearly wrong. So what the government had said about the war had simply not panned out. And so they began to vote in higher and higher proportion against the government. And Lord North in March of 1782 essentially decided to resign rather than face defeat in the House of Commons. Even the military men in the House of Commons, and they were still allowed to sit as serving officers and as serving seamen. They were able to sit in the House of Commons. The majority of them were voting against the war, which is very telling. But the fact is, Britain went on to create a much larger empire than existed in 1776 with the expansion in India, so that by the time George III died, the British Empire comprised a fifth of the world's population, and it was known as the empire upon which the sun never sets.
Right, bigger than the Roman Empire, bigger than anything that we can compare it to. So if you widen the lens from the 1750s all the way up through the early 19th century, the American Revolution is a small sidebar as far as the great expanse of the British Empire. And in many ways, it was a very wise move not to be bled of further, treasure and people in the war, and just to cut losses and move along. And then, of course, you don't know this down the road, but eventually, the Great Britain and America become such intense allies. So it seemed like a difficult move, but a wise move nonetheless. Well, with my last question, I always ask historians, why does this is all interesting and fascinating, and there are great character studies, great leadership studies. But is there something in this particular story about the way the American Revolution played out, looking at it from two sides, that is important today? Like, is there a relevance to this story, or something that's particularly important in our times now in 2018 where history can kind of inform us to some degree?
Well, in some ways, it's encouraging that even a massive power, it's very difficult for them to defeat a population. And that for Jefferson was a huge insight, that the people, when motivated, could be more powerful than a major state. And that continues to be true. And so we always, therefore, need to consider what is the opinion on the ground. The importance is not just whether it's a guerrilla war. guerrilla wars can be defeated. And in fact, there was a very interesting British historian who visited here in Worcester and wrote what I think is still the greatest book about the British side in terms of its encyclopedic coverage of all campaigns, although that doesn't necessarily make it highly readable, but it's a remarkable work. And he's called Piers Mackesy, The War for America. And he gave a lecture at Clark University in the early 1970s, Could Britain have won the American War of Independence? And he was actually arguing, contrary to my argument, that they could. And he gives the example of the British campaign in Malaya in the 1950s. And so it is true, guerrilla warfare can be defeated, but I think the key difference is where opinion lies. And, a population really can withstand a much stronger country if motivated.
Yeah, and I think also it has to do with time, too. The longer a war of reconquest or a war of repression, whatever we want to call that kind of war, the longer it plays out, the harder it is to sustain it because the cost becomes so evident. So part of it is no doubt that.
The very presence of troops begins to alienate civilians. The British army started to plunder, and even the loyalists were angry at them for their behavior, indiscriminate behavior. And remember, they started this war regarding each other as brothers. And in fact, all calling themselves Englishmen. Even the Patriots argued that they were defending the English Constitution, and this was a fratricidal war. They ended considering each other, and this happened very early in the war, foreign enemies.
Right. I teach a seminar on war, and one of the books we often read is David Hackett Fisher's book, Washington's Crossing, which really chronicles that story in New Jersey. And this was, 7, 8, 10 years ago when I first did it. And a student at one point said, this sounds like Iraq, with this idea of an insurgent population that has this occupying army that is just trying to do what armies do, but inevitably hurting people, destroying property, violating civil liberties. And it really inflamed the population. And they were making that direct connection between the past and the present. So,
and even if you've gone in to help people, it can. But of course, every country has it. I mean, Russia had its own Afghanistan campaign that failed, and there's no real reason why they should be more successful in Syria. The other question, of course, is to decide, how long a military campaign should be and when do you get out.
Right.
And it is worth remembering that there were people in England who thought that Britain should never give up. And their argument was quite a good one, that without America, Britain would cease to be a major power. But that proved to be untrue. But it is those kinds of myths that often sustain a war. There are beliefs that if we fail, there will be certain consequences, which sometimes, in fact, prove not to be true.
Right. It immediately called to mind what President Johnson said over and over again in the 1960s to explain escalation in Vietnam. And I guess there's probably countless other examples. Well,
domino effect.
Exactly. We have to hold the line here. Well, Andrew O'Shaughnessy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us at In the Past Lane, and looking forward to your talk tonight at the American Antiquarian Society.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Andrew O'Shaughnessy is the author of the book, The Men Who Lost America: British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire, published by Yale University Press. The American Antiquarian Society, where our conversation took place, is located in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's one of the nation's leading libraries and archives of materials related to American history before 1876. It's a place where scholars like Andrew O'Shaughnessy conduct research, but it also has a terrific schedule of speakers and public programs. You can learn more about it at its website, americanantiquarian.org. I'll post a link to this at the show page for this episode. And remember, you can learn more about the period of the American Revolution by checking out other In the Past Lane episodes, like number 17, my conversation with historian Alan Taylor, or number 49, where I talked to Gordon Wood about the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, or number 41, where Dean Snow talks about the pivotal Battle of Saratoga, or number 23, where Stephen Knott talks about his dual biography of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, or Carol Birkin, episode 28, in which she talks about the crisis of the 1790s. All right, everyone. Time to close out this episode of In the Past Lane. As always, thanks for listening. To learn more about the stuff we discussed in this episode, just go to our show page at inthepastlane.com. There you'll find recommended readings, links, and more. And people, please, send us your comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter, where I tweet as @InThePastLane, and Instagram, same thing, In the Past Lane, and Facebook at In the Past Lane Podcast. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Okay, Lulu, you get the last word. Go.
It smells like something died in this studio.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.